All right, so here's my audience. There you go. All right, so once again, my name's Ethan. Nice to talk to you all again. So today I'm going to be talking about Medicare for All as my informative speech topic. So just to start with, basically every day in what is like the richest country in the history of the world, people die because they don't have access to health care. Bit of an inconvenient truth, but there are ways that the federal government can prevent that from happening. So one of those ways, and the one we'll be talking about today, is Medicare for All. So this is a policy and that would help ensure that every American has access to health care. Basically, it's relevant to everyone because everyone deals with health insurance and healthcare on a day-to-day basis, and this would lessen the burden of private insurance in relation to people's lives. So more specifically, I'm going to attempt to inform you guys a little bit about what Medicare for All is, why it's important, and then if it has a future as like actual policy, whatnot. And then from a credibility standpoint, I'm obviously not an expert in this topic at all, but I do work on healthcare more or less as part of my job on a day-to-day basis, and I've had my own personal healthcare related struggles in life, so I have some background as to this topic in general. So again, just a brief overview of my points. We're going to talk about the history of the U.S. healthcare system very briefly, and then what Medicare for All is, what it does, how it would change the current system, and then we're going to conclude a bit, like I said, with why it's important and, well, more if it's practical, basically. So just a brief overview, and this is according to Robert Brooks of the Journal of Internal Medicine in 2017. He gave a very brief overview of the history of healthcare. Essentially, Democratic politicians and some Republicans for decades have been trying to reform the United States healthcare system, starting in 1935 with the Social Security Act, which created Social Security and was a stepping stone towards social safety net type programs. And then about a decade later, Harry Truman made universal coverage of healthcare a cornerstone of his policies. That never really happened, but that translated into some more landmark legislation later in the 20th century, which was first the Medicare Act of 1965, which created Medicare as we know it today, and then continuing later into that century in 1992, President Clinton, the Clinton administration, made health reform a big key push in their agenda, but which for various reasons never passed as they had hoped, but did create some things called CHIP and Medicare Advantage, which are separate programs, but significant nonetheless. And then most recently, the Obama administration passed the Affordable Care Act, which did a whole host of things and was signed into law in March of 2010. And among all the things it did, it created exchanges for each state for individuals to buy insurance if they didn't already have it through their employer, as well as a host of other things like coverage for people with pre-existing conditions and whatnot. The Republican Party tried to repeal that bill many times, and that's kind of where we are today with healthcare. So no politician has been able to really effectively get to a single-payer system, which we'll talk about in just a second. And in this case, what we're going to be talking about is Medicare for All, which would be that final stepping stone. So there's lots of Medicare for All versions or bills or whatnot, but we're going to talk about Bernie Sanders and Bernie Sanders' bill specifically, which is a single-payer system that would, in theory, expand Medicare benefits to all people. Single payer means that the government is the sole payer of healthcare, so they would provide all of the, they take the burden of the cost, so there's no more federal, or there's no more private insurance plans. Roughly about 11% of the population doesn't have insurance, so that would help those people to get insurance. Additionally, being uninsured is bad for obviously people who are uninsured because they don't have easy access to care, but they also it's also bad for the rest of the population because as people don't have insurance and they go to hospitals, the taxpayer ends up paying for that. So additionally, Dylan Scott of Vox in 2019 kind of dived into this and said how Medicare for All would actually lower costs overall if you took the total number amount spent on healthcare in the United States in the past year, for instance, compared to what we'd spend on Medicare for All, it would actually be less money. We would also be able to negotiate drug prices in the system, which would be a bit of a remedy potentially to the problem we have of just massively high drug prices. The elephant in the room and the problem with this plan, among other things, is kind of the nature of how expensive it is. You'd have to tax people at much higher rates, which obviously would run into some backlash. Though those proponents of the plan would suggest that though you have higher taxes, you'd be paying less overall through deductibles and copays and whatnot. So now that you know a little bit more about what Medicare for All is, we're just going to talk a bit about if it's practical and if it's possible. So first of all, healthcare impacts everyone, like I said. For instance, the Affordable Care Act made it so that people can stay on their parents' health insurance until they were age of 26. So like each major reform has things that have impacted lots of people. This plan, though, would have difficulty becoming law, mainly because healthcare is a very contentious issue and it's very complex, and Republicans generally are opposed to big government plans like this. Additionally, Julie Rovner of Kaiser Health News in 2019 did say, as a bit of a final note, that the Democratic Party, the Bernie Sanders plan has kind of pushed the Democratic Party more left in terms of healthcare talking points and whatnot. And as we get into 2020 and the new presidential election, the next presidential election, you'll tend to notice that more and more, that the debate has shifted a bit due to the introduction of this policy. So again, my main point is just that healthcare is always changing. Medicare for All, I hope you know a little bit more about that, and that this law, though maybe has some potential benefits, will have some trouble becoming law in the future. So in closing, thank you for watching, and I hope you know a little bit more about this issue. Thank you.